All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Angélica Clayton. I am a fourth-year PhD candidate at Yale University, working on a dissertation on the history of trauma in the United States in the late 20th century. And today I'm going to be talking about a part of my dissertation that I've sort of tentatively called Traumatic Entanglements, Rape Trauma Syndrome, and the Interrelation of Mind, Body, and Environment. So, as many of you already know, the 1970s in the United States was marked by a surge of research in psychological trauma. And the starting point for this history is often the Vietnam War veterans research and then the addition of post-traumatic stress disorder to the DSM-3 in 1980. But I am here to tell a bit of a different history, though it is still a medical one, that starts with a less well-known diagnosis that is mostly faded out of use today. So in 1974, the psychiatric clinical nurse Ann Burgess and the sociologist Linda Holmstrom published a paper analyzing the responses of 92 women who had undergone rape-related experiences. Based on their observations, they described two phases for a woman after they had experienced sexual violence. The first, acute phase, which they called disorganization, concern the somatic and emotional reactions of rape victims in the first weeks after the rape. The second phase, the long-term process or reorganization phase, described when a woman began to turn to particular coping mechanisms to reorganize her lifestyle. These two phases describe together what Burgess and Holmstrom called rape trauma syndrome. In my larger dissertation project, and on a smaller scale in this presentation, I'm hoping to ask what can be learned when we take a different point of origin for this history of trauma work. What do we find if we begin this history with rape trauma syndrome rather than post-traumatic stress disorder? So in this talk, I'm going to take you through two different spaces where rape trauma syndrome as a diagnosis remade understandings of women who had experienced sexual violence. And yes, this was a diagnosis that was originally applied to only women. First, I'll talk a bit about the original description of the diagnosis itself and how it presented itself as a new embodied psychological identity. Then I'll move into the courtroom and discuss how expert testimony talking about rape trauma syndrome was used in rape trials during the 1980s and 1990s, and how the trials with rape trauma syndrome testimonies paradoxically decentered the embodiment of trauma while placing expectations for victims' bodies to practice and perform trauma. I'll then end with just a few remarks on how this contributed to a larger conversation that was taking place regarding mind, body, and environment, most notably in reference to the memory wars, and then later on to the adverse childhood experiences study. So returning to Burgess and Holmstrom, for this talk, I'm not going to be going into the details of how their study was undertaken because I'm more interested here in interrogating how rape trauma syndrome described a traumatic reaction. Burgess and Holmstrom's work not only identified shared experiences between women who had been raped, it gave the collection of these experiences a name, legitimizing the event of rape itself as a catalyst for changing a woman's life experience and self-understanding. The acute phase of this syndrome described short-term behavioral, emotional, and somatic reactions. This included impact reactions, which described the way a woman expressed themselves when they came into the clinic immediately following the rape. Somatic reactions, which included physical trauma from the rape itself, skeletal muscle tension, gastrointestinal irritability, and genitourinary disturbance. And then finally, emotional reactions, which included feelings like fear, humiliation, embarrassment, anger, revenge, or self-blame. The second long-term process or reorganization phase described a period in which the woman would rely on coping mechanisms to reorganize their lives and regain a feeling of control. This included things like nightmares, development of traumatophobias, or in other words, the development of phobias related to the circumstances of the rape, and then a larger category called motor activity, which included such behaviors as moving residences, taking trips, changing telephone numbers, and reaching out to social networks for support. So you might ask, why should you care about rape trauma syndrome if we already know about PTSD? Well, historically, it was being used to name the unification of traumatic experience and symptomology by showing that it was normal to have mental, physical, and social difficulties after experiencing a rape, and that these difficulties were not due to some underlying natural or inborn disorder, as was often assumed before this era. Now, of course, PTSD also articulated this, but when people were talking about the rape of an adult or an adolescent woman in the 80s and the 90s, rape trauma syndrome was what was often being used to do so. You find it in courtrooms, newspapers, magazines, activist handouts, information pamphlets, and even training presentations that I found from feminist organizations. But where and how often it was used was not at all that made rape trauma syndrome stand out. RTS was by no means just a subset or replication of PTSD. It was distinctly and uniquely situated for those who had experienced sexual violence, and this was articulated very explicitly by Burgess and Holmstrom in the original description. So first, because it put forth a different temporal understanding of trauma that split traumatic illness into two distinct phases centered around questions of victims' organization and control over their life. Second, since some of the traumatic reactions were exacerbated by public misconceptions of rape, the social environment contributed to the traumatic reaction as well. Although the psychological impact of traumatic events was not immediately accepted for other traumatized groups like war veterans, the reality of the traumatic event itself, that they had indeed been at war and seen terrible violence, was not being doubted. But the very things that rape victims said happened in their traumatic experience, as we know, was what was being called unreliable and often what was being called into question. These were surrounded by rhetorics of disbelief and blaming the victim. The impact of this social milieu was written into the description of rape trauma syndrome as an important cause for feelings like shame, or even with some women, an inability to discuss their experience with others, which is what Burgess and Holmstrom called a silent rape reaction. In other words, the social was part of and contributed to the medical. The social environment had real health impacts and was entangled with the mental, the emotional, and, as you'll see, the body. So this brings me to my third point. The third thing that set RTS apart from PTSD was the way it explicitly articulated trauma, not just as an interrelation of mind and social environment, but also mind and body and environment. So in the DSM-3, PTSD did include two explicit references to the body. It acknowledged that there can be a, quote, concomitant physical component to the trauma, which may even involve direct damage to the central nervous system, like malnutrition or head trauma, and that, quote, symptoms of excessive autonomic arousal, such as hyperalertness, exaggerated startle response, and difficulty falling asleep were not uncommon. So let's just compare this to the original definition of rape trauma syndrome, looking at the acute phase first, where Burgess and Holmstrom elevated bodily reactions to rape right alongside emotional and mental ones. And this is why they placed somatic reactions as its own category of symptoms that included not only physical injury from the traumatic event, but also physical ailments, as I discussed earlier. In other words, rape trauma syndrome privileged the embodiment of trauma and the way trauma could be held in the body as tension or pain. But I also want to consider embodiment in terms of bodies in movement and in interaction. This is the bridging of the physical with the social, the body with the environment, and also where rape trauma syndrome's second long-term or reorganization phase comes into this discussion. So I mentioned the motor activity as part of the long-term phase of rape trauma syndrome earlier, where victims would take trips or change their living arrangements or reach out to friends and family. We can imagine other names for this group of behaviors, perhaps even simply social reorganization to go along with the theme of this long-term process. But the authors chose motor activity, which calls attention to the ways that all these behaviors exhibit bodies in motion. Traumatophobias also called attention to a reconfiguring of one's body within and in relation to their environment. We can see this in the fearing and avoiding of types of places that reminded the victim of the rape, as well as in the changes victims experienced in their interpersonal interactions, such as a new fear of crowds or a new fear of certain sexual behaviors. So trauma in RTS changed the way an individual moved their body through their environments and in relation to other bodies. The interest I have in rape trauma syndrome as an alternative starting point for trauma work in the last decades of the 20th century rests primarily with this entanglement of mind, body, environment that is not as explicitly articulated in PTSD. And perhaps this is because PTSD was the official diagnosis added to the DSM, and so it had to adhere more strictly to particular medical rubrics. But starting with RTS, we are still telling a medical history. It's just one that does not limit trauma to a biomedical model, and it challenges the boundaries between mind, body, and environment in a way we might not have anticipated. This particular interest of mine is building off the work of many amazing scholars, but just to name a few, such as Anne-Marie Moll, Elizabeth Wilson, Victoria Pitts-Taylor, Sammy Schalk, who are all trying to articulate the importance of feminist scholars attending to the body once again as a co-constitutive agent in defining the human and the self. It also contributes to a conversation being had by scholars like Mel Chen, Vanessa Agger-Jones, and Michelle Murphy, who are pushing us to question the boundedness of our bodies and ourselves in our environments. These three last authors highlight how histories of colonialism, racism, labor, and heteropatriarchy render some bodies more exposed than others to toxins, to violent environments, to disease, and indeed to trauma. I will return to this particular point at the end of my talk, but I hope you can begin to see how this history of rape trauma syndrome contributes to some of these larger conversations that are working to both embody and unbound the human. But all right, so let's move out of the clinic and into my second historical site of analysis, and that's the courtroom, asking us to attend to where we can find embodiment after RTS entered the legal sphere. So I'll begin with where the victim's body was most obviously included in rape trials, namely in the use of what Andrea Quinlan has called the technoscientific witness of rape, i.e. the rape kit. And this includes, at certain points in history, associated materials like DNA evidence or photographs of the injuries incurred during the assault. What we're talking about here is not necessarily embodiment, because it's not an inhabited body that is put on display for the jury. They're not hearing about how the victim's body felt to the victim, partly because that kind of subjective reporting was considered untrustworthy. As Quinlan and others have discussed, the body here is a crime scene from which physical evidence was gathered, organized, and interpreted. And this evidence was considered trustworthy or real because it was supposedly non-subjective, physical, and therefore immutable fact. So this is not really so much a case of embodiment as it is a presentation of the body as an object of inquiry. And at first blush, looking at these histories, this seems to be where the body in the court ends. It seems isolated in the experience of the assault in the past. And so embodied trauma or traumatized bodies only existed during or immediately after the specific traumatic experience, or so we might think. And unexpectedly, expert testimony on RTS seemed to further decenter the body as well. RTS testimony served as a vehicle for talking about the psychological well-being of the victim instead of the biopsychosocial theory of trauma that it really was meant to support originally. This contributed to the isolation of the traumatized body in the moment of traumatic experience, while traumatized minds were allowed to persist into the present and the future. It decoupled the mind and body through time instead of through the separation of the material and the immaterial self. And this all makes a lot of sense, especially if the technoscientific witness that was the rape kit supposedly spoke more accurately and truthfully about the body than the woman ever could. The therapists and the psychiatrists were the only ones who could speak to the mind, but we had a more trustworthy witness to tell us about the body. And it's true that RTS did not seem to speak about the body much when it was brought into the courtroom. However, it did unintentionally make embodiment a centerpiece of the rape trial itself in an unexpected way. Evidence related to RTS could only be used in a limited way during these trials, especially early on. Experts were allowed to testify about what RTS entailed and the general behaviors that were exhibited by those suffering from it, but they were not often allowed to say that a particular woman was indeed suffering from RTS, as this would be too close to claiming that the rape had actually occurred and it could prejudice the jury. For instance, in People v. Bledsoe, expert Leslie Jacobson-Wigg, a rape counselor who had treated the complainant, testified that she was obviously suffering from it being rape trauma syndrome. The courts ruled this evidence inadmissible because symptoms consistent with rape trauma syndrome could not be definitive proof that a rape had actually occurred, that that woman indeed had it. Jacobson-Wigg was not using her testimony to explain unusual or atypical behavior to the jury members, but rather was making an unwarranted legal claim about the event in question for the case. There was a similar ruling in State v. McGee and State v. Saldana, and then State v. Taylor in 1984. And these are just a few examples of many examples from this era. Cases that approved expert testimony on rape trauma syndrome, like Delia S. v. Torres and State v. Robinson, deemed it admissible because rape victim behavior was beyond the common knowledge of the jury, and so helped fight any claims or assumptions that the victim's behavior was inconsistent with her claim of rape. In these cases, experts were allowed to testify about what different sorts of rape victim behaviors were common or generally acknowledged. In other words, expert testimonies were to focus on and explain a certain prototype of a rape victim, even if that prototype was somewhat flexible and varied from trial to trial, accounting for different types of emotional reactions. The nature of this expert testimony created a practice of matching the individual to the prototype the jury had been given. And that means matching the victim's past behaviors as well as how they carried themselves into the courtroom. As Burgess and Holmstrom themselves wrote in another essay from the 1970s, one becomes a victim when one is acknowledged as a victim by others. Victimhood is interpersonal. In order for the woman to be considered a victim of rape in the courtroom, they had to fit the description of rape trauma syndrome given by the expert witness and have that acknowledged by the jury, that they fit that description. So the jury-victim interaction became evidence as well. How the woman looked, how she carried herself, if she cried, if she was distressed, if she was calm, all of her body language was evidence one way or another, depending on if it fit that given description of RTS. So I look at that victim-juror interaction as an interface between bodies itself, one in which the jury created an understanding of the victim as an other, a traumatized individual unlike themselves. I'm taking this specifically from the feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed's work that looks at how othering necessarily occurs in intimate, embodied, interpersonal interactions. In looking at these explanations, we see how trauma became an embodied practice in the courtroom. In order for women to pursue particular goals, such as a guilty verdict for their attacker and justice more broadly construed, they had to perform trauma for the jury, or at least detail how they appropriately performed trauma before. This is similar to how Adriana Petrina describes biological citizenship in her book, Life Exposed, where citizens of Chernobyl must use their body and perform their illness to negotiate justice, rights, and assistance. Of course, it's important to note that this practice could not be carried out by all bodies. As I've mentioned before, RTS was really very specifically a diagnosis for women. And that meant that a lot of jury members felt it was more of a stretch to apply this to men, children, trans people, or anybody who was genderqueer. It was also distinctly a white diagnosis. And we have to attend to the many legacies of dismissing or diminishing pain in Black bodies because they were considered more resilient or that it was assumed they could take it. These are some assumptions that jury members and judges carried into the courtroom with them. And it dates back centuries to the Atlantic slave trade and the idea that Black bodies were more suitable for hard labor and enduring painful punishments. Layer this with the assumptions that Black women were both hypersexual, aggressive, and overdramatic, these assumptions that were circulating then and still are today. And there's even more of a chasm created between rape trauma syndrome's traumatized rape victim and any Black or brown woman who entered the courtroom practicing trauma in an attempt to validate their victimhood. Now, just to end my talk, I want to situate this piece of history or this origin point within my larger dissertation project and within larger histories of trauma that were interrogating the connections between mind, body, and environment. So first, and perhaps obviously, we have the recovered memory debates of the 1990s, where women were unearthing memories of childhood sexual abuse during therapy and accusing family members decades later. As these debates raged between people like psychiatrists and psychologists, the question was being asked on a very public stage. Can a trauma exist if it doesn't sit in the mind as a memory? If the trauma does still exist for these people, impacting their lives before and after they remember it again, then where did it exist for all that time that they couldn't remember it? In the brain? Was the memory somehow stored in the body, as Lenore Terre's work seems to suggest by her observations of traumatic reenactment in children's play, even if they don't remember the traumatic experience itself? These debates enforced an already widening rift in the trauma community between those that were involved in the Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation on the one hand, and then those who were primarily associated with the Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, which is now called the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. Those concerned with the dissociative disorders tended to support the recovered memory claims, since they were often thinking about the ways dissociation, when occurring during a traumatic experience and detaching the mind from the body, could complicate the encoding of that traumatic memory and information. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, whether you believe it exists or not, was interrogating the mind-body connection itself. How was it that someone could not be aware of what their body does for hours or even days on end? How could an alter develop distinct allergies and tastes when they exist in the mind and body of the traumatized person? Are these traumatized people their body, their personalities, their brain? Where is their self located? The International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation lost a lot of membership during the memory wars, and a lot of people actually moved from the ISSTD to what was then the STSS, Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. And they moved because of the stigma that was becoming attached to DID and its association with what critics called false memory syndrome. Through interrogations of memory, both sides of this debate were also probing the relationship between mind and body. And that's really the important part here, and how rape trauma syndrome sort of, is part of this longer history. So I want to finally sort of end with putting this history of RTS in relation to the adverse childhood experiences study that was conducted in the 1990s. And this study sort of serves as an endpoint in my own historical work for my dissertation at the moment. I won't go into this in great detail, but I hope I can use this to illustrate a bigger point that begins with rape trauma syndrome. So the ACEs study showed how traumatic or adverse experiences in childhood, including sexual abuse and rape, could lead to biomedical conditions later in life, like heart disease or diabetes. This effectively extended the timeline of the biomedical embodiment of trauma past the acute phase that Burgess and Holmstrom described, since that acute phase really was only meant to last for a few weeks after the rape. ACEs posited that adverse experiences had a, quote, strong dose relationship, borrowing language from toxicology, with a strong dose relationship with later life biomedical issues, talking about trauma as if it were a toxin passing between bodies in an environment, and importantly, as something that accumulated in bodies. The more adverse experiences you had in childhood, the more extreme biomedical conditions you would likely have later on in life. This language of trauma as toxin and as accumulation furthers the mind-body environment interaction I've discussed thus far and allows researchers to acknowledge the traumatizing effects of systemic and structural racism and the ways they recreated violence in the everyday lives of people of color in the United States. But the language of toxicity also invites in a longer history of race and racialization, just as scholars like Mel Chen, Michelle Murphy, and Vanessa Agra-Jones have pointed out in their work. In histories of chemical exposure, like the history of lead poisoning and toxicity, people of color were construed as more proximate to the toxins, in this case, to trauma, and therefore as naturalized to those toxins. This fed into assumptions of resiliency and immunity, which made it easier to trivialize and denigrate claims of harm. This goes back to my earlier discussion on how distance was created between the accepted model of a rape victim and then women of color who had experienced sexual violence. So I'm going to end there, and I thank you all for your time. I'm so excited to discuss this with everybody. And I hope that this just gives you a snapshot into how I believe that, this history allows us to see how people use trauma to ask, what does it mean to be human, and complicate the distinctions and boundaries between mind, body, and environment that we often take for granted. So thank you. I'm very excited to discuss this more with everybody.